Hello everyone, welcome to Read the Right Thing Book Reviews. I'm Eric, thanks for tuning in. Hope you're staying cool in this summer heat wave. Richard Ford is an American author of short stories and novels. Raymond Carver said about this book, Ford is a masterful writer. This is the second book in the Frank Bascombe series. I reviewed The Sports Writer last summer, so if you've read that and want to check that out, I'll leave that link in the description. This is a great piece of American realism, a slice of American life and a character study of Frank Bascombe. Frank Bascombe represents a common perspective in America. He's white, middle class, divorced Democrat living in New Jersey. And Richard Ford holds up a mirror, or you could say a window, to American society. The book is narrated by Frank Bascombe with his funny, searing, true thoughts and observations. The last time we saw Frank Bascombe was Easter weekend, and he was 38 years old. Frank was a short story, a one-time successful novelist turned sports writer. Frank is a divorced everyman living in New Jersey and traveling with his new girlfriend. Although Richard Ford actually thinks the term everyman is baloney because Frank is a very specific character. According to Ford, the term everyman is a cockamamie term designed and dreamed up by critics. But do I think this is cockamamie and baloney? Not necessarily. Certain characters are relatable. I mean, it's usually the goal of the writer to have the character be relatable, so I guess everyman just means that. It's now 4th of July weekend in 1988, and Frank is 44 years old. But he's still making astute, funny, dead-on societal observations. Independence Day is American realism at its finest. This story shouldn't be interesting at all. It should be really boring. We should be bored out of our skulls. A portion of the book is Frank dealing with the 4th of July traffic, motel guests, and a root beer stand he is part owner of. It's 451 pages of average American nothingness. Nothing overly exciting or dramatic happens, but then why is it so interesting and entertaining? And it's because of Ford's writing and Frank's observations and narrations. Frank has a busy 4th of July weekend planned. He'll see his girlfriend, Solly Caldwell, take his 15-year-old son, Paul, on a father-son trip to 2 different halls of fame, the basketball and the baseball. Paul is in a situation where some teenage boys find themselves, teetering between normal rebellion and future psychopath loser and prison inmate. Paul's therapist says he is intellectually beyond his years, but also emotionally underdeveloped. Paul has been arrested for shoplifting Magnum condoms and awaits a court date by the security guard who is accusing him of assault and battery. So it's not looking too good for Frank's son, Paul. Frank hopes to connect and instruct his son. He sent him a copy of Emerson's Self-Reliance, and he hopes to have in-depth discussion about human possibility, what we're dependent on, how we are independent, and how they might not worry about things too much. It's safe to say Frank is expecting the best. Frank himself wants and hopes for other things too. He hopes Paul will come live with him in the fall, so he can have a chance to straighten things out. Frank wants a second chance with his ex-wife, Anne, which seems impossible because Anne thinks Frank is the most cynical man in the world, and she is also remarried to an architect named Charlie Odell, and she and the kids both live in Connecticut. Anne tells Frank she honestly doesn't like him anymore, and even calls him a liar. Frank also wants a more serious relationship with his new girlfriend, Sally. Frank says he wants all these things, but I get the feeling Frank doesn't even really know what he wants. But he feels these are things that he should want. Maybe he feels if he expresses enough wants, even if they aren't true, then at least some of them will come true and something good will happen. If you haven't already, please take a quick second to hit the like button and consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Now back to the rest of the review on Independence Day. The entire perspective of this book is really just an American guy. In my review of The Sports Writer, I mentioned how Bruce Springsteen recommended these books during his guest DJ spot on E Street Radio. Frank and most American guys like Bruce Springsteen are pulled into 2 different types of lifestyles. There's the American guy popularized in movies and entertainment, the cowboy traveling, lonesome, free, and out for an adventurous life, and then there is the guy who settles down with a wife and starts a family. I think every American guy crosses this fork in the road. Bruce Springsteen even talks about this fork in the road on a podcast with Barack Obama. Frank obviously chooses the route of marriage and family and more settled down lifestyle. But after his divorce with Anne, he had a trial as the somewhat lonesome, wandering, adventurous type. Frank is no longer a sports writer but a realtor in Haddam, New Jersey. And he also lives in his ex-wife's house. He could have lived anywhere, but he chose his ex-wife's home because he craves stability for when his kids visit and something familiar for himself. Frank's new profession as a realtor gives him opportunities to commentate on the human condition and the nature of being, of living somewhere and in some place. He says you don't sell a house, you sell a life and a lifestyle. Some of my favorite observations of his were on real estate and just humans existing. As someone who has tried moving and living in different places to create another life, you soon realize that things are pretty much the same everywhere. There are these little differences, but at the end of the day, it's pretty much the same life. Some of us think we'll be happier in that next house or that next place. It's all about wanting to feel a part of something, wanting to fit in. And there's a quote I heard I like. It says, "No matter where you go, there you are." Frank doesn't think a place or a dream home can truly make anyone's life better. He describes a part where he left where he was living to move into his ex-wife's house, Anne. He says, "One bright and green August day, I simply walked out the door and down the steps of my house, leaving all my furniture except for books and nostalgic attachments. My map of Block Island, a hatch-covered table, a leather chair I liked, my marriage bed. Drove over to Anne's house on Cleveland, with all her old new furniture sitting exactly where she'd left it, and took up residence. I was allowed to keep my old phone number. And truth to tell, I hardly noticed the difference. So often had I lain awake nights in my old place or roamed the rooms and halls of hers when all were sleeping, searching, I suppose, for where I fit in, all where I'd gone wrong, or how I could breathe air into my ghostly self and become a recognizable, if changed for the better, figure in their sweet lives or my own. One house is as good as another for this kind of private enterprise." And the poet was right again. Let the winged fancy roam, pleasure never is at home. Frank would often use sports and careers of athletes he interviewed as a metaphor for life in The Sports Writer. Now he's using being a realtor and real estate as his main metaphor. In the beginning of the book, Frank tries to collect rent from the tenants Larry and Betty McLeod. He can never seem to find Larry home, and he worries that they're the type of family that would go nuts, barricade themselves in the house, and fire shots at the police. The McLeods seem to be dodging him, and the neighborhood isn't so sure of Frank either. But he takes this whole thing in stride and he says, even though he suspects they could possibly one day go crazy, that's no grounds to evict them. We also see Frank showing homes to an interesting couple named Joe and Phyllis Markham. These are two kind of hard-headed clients of his from Vermont. He has already shown 45 plus houses to this couple, and they find a problem with each one. The Markhams have an idea of what they want. They want this dream house in this perfect neighborhood and this perfect yard and this perfect home in Haddam, New Jersey. But Frank knows the truth. He knows they can't afford this. So he tries to show them the next best things and things that are more in their price range. Even though he thinks Joe is a loser and they will probably get divorced anyway, he tries to maintain a professional attitude. My favorite parts of the book were Frank's interactions and internal commentary on the Markhams. I'm sure every realtor has felt this disdain for certain clients who find problems in every home that they're shown, but they have to put a smile on their face and keep on showing the next house anyway. What the Markhams don't understand, and what Frank seems to understand, is that life is full of disappointments. And like the Rolling Stones said, you don't always get what you want. Once the Markhams not only accept that, but embrace that, they'll be better off. Unhappily, the Markhams, out of ignorance and pig-headedness, have failed to intuit the one Gnostic truth of real estate. A truth impossible to reveal without seeming dishonest and cynical, that people never find or buy the dream house they say they want. A market economy, so I've learned, is not even remotely premised on anybody getting what he wants. The premise is that you're presented with what you might have thought you didn't want, but what's available, whereupon you give in and start finding ways to feel good about it and yourself. And not that there's anything wrong with that scheme. Why should you only get what you think you want, or be limited by what you can simply plan on? Life's never like that, and if you're smart, you'll decide it's better the way it is. Frank has thoughts on homes and place and how Americans treat those things as an extension of themselves. Where you live says something about you. Americans and humans, we sanctify places and things, whether they be hometowns, houses, beaches, or a street corner where something magical happened. Frank thinks we would be much better off if we stopped sanctifying these places. It's just a place. It really has no value. I'm not sure what chokes me up, either the place's familiarity or its rigid reluctance to act familiar. It is another useful theme and exercise of the existence period, and is patent lesson of the realty profession, to cease sanctifying places, houses, beaches, hometowns, a street corner where you once kissed a girl, a parade around where you marched in line, a courthouse where you secured a divorce on a cloudy day in July, but where there is now no sign of you, no mention in the air's breath that you were there, or that you were ever, importantly you, or that you even were. All of this might sound very pessimistic, and it probably is. But I don't think Frank Bascombe is a pessimist. But everyone around him and a lot of readers probably view him as a pessimist. Frank is one of my favorite characters, and he kind of reminds me of a grown-up Holden Caulfield. In my opinion, Frank has the perfect balance between hope and cynicism, kind of a hopeful realist. It seems he has matured since we last saw him in The Sports Writer, but then again, certain events suggest otherwise. He wants to remarry his wife, but then he unexpectedly tells his girlfriend Sally on the telephone that he loves her, only to start thinking about how that conversation would change if he put the word don't in front of I love you. Paul and Frank check into a bed and breakfast in Cooperstown, and Paul wanders off while Frank takes a nap. After several hours, Frank wakes up and instead of looking for Paul, his troubled son who could be doing anything, Frank strikes up a somewhat flirtatious interaction with the bed and breakfast cook. So maybe he hasn't matured. If you were counting, he's talked to his wife about remarrying, told his girlfriend he loved her, now started a flirtatious conversation with a complete stranger. So maybe he hasn't matured, or he's just really good at living in the moment. I don't think he's dishonest or a jerk or anything. I think he's just very self-centered like most people are. Frank does have a very interesting personality and point of view. This point of view, it doesn't make me sad, overly happy, or nostalgic. It can inspire me to take advantage of the time left that I have, while also questioning what the whole point is. Ford's writing is hilarious and does make me laugh. Frank's experiences with his son Paul make me question why anyone would want kids. Teenagers, they sound absolutely miserable. At this point in Frank's life, he has entered what he calls the existence period. I think he is more hopeful and rolls with the punches a little better. Frank calls this part the part that comes after the big struggle which led to the big blow up. He's more honest with himself now, I think, too. His entire belief system, essentially, is to just lower your expectations. He even tries to teach this to Joe Markham. I think it's sad but an important lesson to learn. If you lower your expectations, it's kind of an easy way to achieve more happiness. If you just lower your expectations, you'll be much happier. Another thing I love about Richard Ford in this book is it seems Ford is more concerned about character than plot. Most of the characters don't necessarily matter to the story or the plot, but they matter to Frank and they matter to his observations. A lot of times the characters are just vehicles where Frank can get his observations out. They might teach us more about Frank, but then again they might not. Ford rejects the conventional plot of a novel and focuses solely on characters. There isn't really a beginning, middle, or end, but just events that kind of take place. And that's what makes the book seem so real. It reminds me of a story I read about director David O. Russell, who's directed things like Silver Linings Playbook and American Hustle. And I heard on the set of American Hustle, Christian Bale was growing worried about the plot. He was worried about the story. Christian Bale thought the audience would become confused and lost. And David O. Russell basically told him, fuck the story, it's all about the characters. The plot will work itself out, let's just make people connect to these characters. Which I think is also what Richard Ford kind of does. I don't think it's a coincidence the holidays that Richard Ford chooses as a backdrop to these stories. The Sports Writer is centered around Easter, which is a holiday of rebirth and resurrection. The spring flowers are blooming and everything is thawing out for summer. Independence Day is centered on 4th of July weekend, which should be a day of reflecting on freedoms, rights, and the American existence. But of course, it's just a holiday where a lot of fat people celebrate American exceptionalism by eating hot dogs and burgers. We celebrate with flamboyant decorations, indulgent barbecues, and explosive fireworks. Frank isn't one to celebrate this way, though. Frank doesn't particularly enjoy these celebrations. Frank would rather celebrate by himself, quietly reflecting on the freedoms while reading the Declaration of Independence. He doesn't actually do this, of course, but that's just what he says he would want to do. The actual holiday doesn't occur until the last few pages of the book. Frank isn't really a fan of all the pageantry and simulated freedoms of the holiday, like men dressing up as Minutemen or Uncle Sam. Amongst this important holiday, everyone puts on a fake veneer. Frank is the only truthful one, at least on the outside. And this fake simulation, it's not the first time we see this in the book. While in Cooperstown to go to the Baseball Hall of Fame, they go to Doubleday Field to just kind of wander around. And he watches these old men pretending to be baseball players. They're dressed in uniforms and they even simulate a game from the 60s. Now on the 4th, there are old men pretending to be Uncle Sam. Frank is content with being himself and trying to piece together his jagged existence. Frank says about these celebrations, even the smallest public rigmarole is a pain in the ass. And even though he says these things, he ends up going to the parade anyway. There's no real closure or finality to this book. Frank just continues existing and living his life. Maybe him and Sally get married, or maybe they break up within a week. Maybe Paul figures out his life, or maybe he continues on this tragic downfall. There is no big dramatic experience or moral to the story or thing learned, And I think that's what makes it so great. It just continues. Should you read The Sports Writer before reading this? I would say yes. It's not really necessary. You will understand the story fine. But I think the interesting thing is seeing how Frank evolves from The Sports Writer to Independence Day, or how he hasn't evolved. If you like American realism and great writing, then I would recommend this book. This book was definitely the right thing for me. I was chuckling through it, laughing through it. You just have to realize that it's American realism, so there's not going to be some big final moment where it's like, okay, he's learned everything, everything's solved. There's none of that. A comment on my Sports Writer review, the commenter said Richard Ford reminds him of Philip Roth. So if you enjoy Philip Roth, you might also like Richard Ford. Well, that's my review of Richard Ford's Independence Day. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. I would really appreciate it. And once again, thanks for tuning in. See you next time.